Good evening, everybody. It is I, Nick, Pennsylvania, here on another very chilly, wintry night. I am looking outside my window and I am surprised to see some snowflakes that I was not anticipating this evening. But there are a few things that warm the cockles of my heart, quite like a spooky story. And you're Brendan, my friend who is always with us, Brendan Bond, is taking us out west
Hmm.
to California for some tales. Now, he hasn't prefaced me very much at all, other than to tell me the lake that we're kind of in the area of. But it's been a very long day. It's going to be a very long couple weeks for me. I'm really
Hmm.
eager to sit down and listen to some stories and just kind of have a conversation about it. Before we hand things over to Brendan, though, I do want to thank. I was looking and reading some. There's been a couple of things that have come through to us, and I saw there were a couple more people that had reviewed, rated us, and
Oh,
left some comments. It was nice.
nice,
We
nice.
do really appreciate that, and we read everything. So I just want to really thank everybody. There was some website I was on recently that had some statistics for us, and apparently we have quite a number of people in the Philippines listening, which was
Yes.
surprising and equal parts confusing to both of us. But if you happen to be one of those people out in the Philippines, we really do appreciate you tuning in. Now, without any more noise from me, Brendan, take us to California.
Out California way. Yeah. Really what I wanted to talk about tonight was a area that I've kind of had on my radar for quite some time, kind of brought to the forefront recently with all of the wildfires out in Los Angeles. Me and Nick have a lot of friends out in that area. So it's been been on top of mind a lot recently. And
Absolutely.
I figured the way that one of the ways that we could contribute to help, distract people from all that awfulness is to tell some stories about out in California. And one of the areas that I've, again, had my eye on for a long time to talk about is a place called Big Bear, California. The reason that I originally became aware of Big Bear was I'm not sure if you all remember from back in the early 2000s, there was a manhunt for a guy named Chris Dorner. Do you remember this at all? Top of your head, Nick?
No, that's from top of my head, and all honesty, no, that is not ringing a bell.
Yeah. Basically, like you could do. I'm sure there are honestly probably entire podcasts on Chris Dorner. But basically, he was a guy who was disgruntled, ended up murdering some LAPD officers, and there was a manhunt, and the LAPD was really going hard trying to find this guy, and he eventually was found up in Big Bear at a cabin and died up there. He died in a fire actually, and it's a little kind of hinky, but that's a whole other story. But that's why it was put on my radar at first because again, we had friends out in the area, and it was one of those times where like if you have friends in an area, there's just so much tension and so there's some violence happening. You get worried. So Big Bear is all stuck into my head, and I remember at the time looking at it on like Google Maps way back in the day and be like, oh, this area looks really pretty. And it reminded me of a lot of areas that we have here on the East Coast, which are like these large lakes that have basically resort towns built around them. People who listen to us a lot know we talk about places like Ray's Town. And though
Well,
this
I'm
is not
thinking of even Put in Bay, which is kind of like the
put it
opposite. It's a
right,
little island in a great big lake,
right.
but out in Lake
But
Erie, Put in Bay is very famous.
it is, yes. And I mean, even you think of like Snowshoe and you think of just like these places on the East Coast that normally don't have a large population. Big Bear, for those of you who aren't immediately aware, it's in San Bernardino County, so it's east of Los Angeles, kind of on the other side of the mountains. And the town only has about 5,000 year-round residents, which is not many.
No, and again, for someone that I know California is a massive state. It,
Hmm.
it really is. And of course, I'm just talking topographically and population wise. when people hear about like where I live has like 15,000 people, they say, "Wow,
Hmm.
that's really small." And I'm like, "No, no, 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 no. That's very big out this way.
Comparatively.
That's pretty moderate size." So when I hear of a place in California,
Hmm.
in San Bernardino County having fewer than 5,000 people, that's surprising to me.
Right. So now the reason that's so kind of important, that small number, is, on weekends in the summer, between Memorial Day and Labor Day especially, you can have over 100,000 people staying in this town. So the population fluctuates greatly. So the reason I think a place like that, for purposes of us in this podcast, is interesting is you have an area that's very small, that is next to a huge, huge, huge population center, Southern California, and everyone is going there to go on these little vacations, whether it's for a weekend or a week or whatever. And what do people do when they're sitting around campfires? They
Oh,
tell stories.
exactly.
So so you have kind of this like area that isn't meant to be spooky necessarily. It's not like it's built around being spooky. It looks just as pretty as a lot of other really nice natural areas in the area. But if you have a place where folks are showing up and are in kind of a bit of a liminal space, they're, not just working their day jobs, they're meeting up with friends and family, they're sitting around campfires or at dinner or on the boat or whatever, you're more likely to just be telling stories. And I was like, well, I wonder if that leads to more lore in the area, because everyone's like, oh, you go up to Big Bear too. Have you heard about the blank, blank, blank? So that was kind of the premise that I was working under, that a place like this would have more folklore associated with it, both kind of resident folklore, but also some of the stuff that might be brought with it. Because again, if you have 95% of the population on a weekend who's not from there, and they're coming from an area that already has a really diverse population of just different cultures, that's a heck of a melting pot.
Yeah, and again, it's in a wilderness place, right?
Yes, because Big Bear. So it's called Big Bear. It's a town attached to Big Bear Lake, and you'll hear us talk a little bit about Arrowhead Lake too tonight, which is to the west of Big Bear.
Funny enough, my book agent he used to have a cabin at
Oh,
Arrowhead
really?
Lake. He sold it about 5 years ago, but he talked about it a lot. I think
Oh,
he misses it.
I bet.
Um,
I'd probably miss it because these areas seem gorgeous. It seems like it's a nice mix of like wintry mountain fun, but also like some of that high desert vibe. But you have forests and you have all the water, so um, I can understand why someone would have a cabin
there
out
really is a
there.
California. Much like I say, there's a Texas for anyone.
Yeah,
There's a California for anyone.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
It's just one of those places that has everything. And yeah, I'll be quiet, but go on.
Yeah, so like, and the reason why this area is like kind of important from a cultural standpoint is this does kind of sit in the middle of the San Bernardino National Forest, which is a large area. It's a national forest, like we have lots of them out east here too. But so it's a big protected area. Place first saw a influx back in the early 1860s with one of the gold rushes. And it follows a lot of those same patterns that we see with any kind of rush. Out here, we have the oil rushes of old and the fracking rushes of new.
Right.
Uh, and out west, they had all the different gold rushes and silver and everything. So when you're thinking like pop up little mining towns all over the place, you're not far off. Just little old mining towns that have been reclaimed by the forest all over the place over there. One of the other things that was a huge early draw was there was a hot spring that had a hotel pop up. We have a lot of those out here in the East, where they claim to have medicinal purposes, back in the, late 1800s, early
When
1900s.
my wife and I went on honeymoon, we ended up in the Adirondacks at the Sharon Springs, New York,
Yeah, yeah.
which is a sulfur resort where they had
Hmm.
temples like magnesium and whatnot. And it was a really wild place. I don't know if I've ever spoken about it here, but we stayed in a hotel that was built in the
Mm-hmm.
1840s. Oscar Wilde had stayed there. Mark Twain had stayed there.
Yeah.
It was quite when they would do those Chautauqua tours. So it was quite the
Yes.
place. So yeah, this is one of those like mid 19th century resorts built based around the local springs. And yes, you are right. There were quite a few in the area. I know Bedford,
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania was quite well known for them as well.
Right, yeah. And so there's a lot of areas like that that seem familiar from for us out east. But so as a result, you have a lot of the same like pioneer tales and things like that. And a lot of this kind of sets the stage for a lot of the folklore is kind of what I was expecting. When I started really looking into it, and I'll let you guys all decide how right I was to think that there'd be a lot of unique folklore around here, or stuff that just seemed like it came from out east too, you know. So when you first start to look for folklore around Big Bear Lake, you get a lot of what you would expect in the way of Bigfoot reports. We'll get into some of those later. There is a lot of UFO reports, like a lot of the other areas in the Southwest, that we're going to kind of get into. But some of the more classic transferable folklore I want to get into first, the one that pops up when you look at this anywhere is people talk about this restaurant called the Captain's Anchorage Tavern.
Never
So
heard of it.
I never heard of it too, but I thought it was a cool name. So start doing some digging because again, folks who listen to this show or literally any show that talks about ghosts will know is that a town is not a town if it doesn't have an old haunted restaurant.
Yeah, you can't apply for a zip code without a
You can have a
creepy
zip
house
code,
or some
you know,
local haunt.
right, exactly. So that's kind of the premise that I went into this thinking. And what this tavern is, so it was originally constructed in 1947. There's stories from the whole time, but really in the early days of it, one of the first owners of this store, of this restaurant, tavern type place was Andy Devine. Does that name ring a bell to you by chance? It might.
Boy, the way you're very insistent, like I really should be embarrassed that it's not.
So, well, the reason I ask is because I know you watch a lot of older movies. So he was an actor back
Yeah.
in the day. Um, he was in a ton of John Wayne movies and other westerns. I'm not going to do his voice because it just I can't do his voice. But where I think a lot of people might remember his voice in the 1973 Disney version of Robin Hood, he played Friar Tuck. He was the vocal guy for that. He has that real like whistly
Yeah, like through
Western
the
guy
teeth.
voice.
Oh, I he
Yeah,
was in Who Shot Liberty Valance.
he was in
Oh,
I think he was
yeah.
in stuff with Tom Mix. Like he was in like
Whoa, he was in with Tom
I
Mix?
think he was in some of the later Tom Mix, some of the early Tom Mix
Because
stuff.
I mean,
Well,
Tom Mix was,
early for
yeah,
him, late for Tom Mix. Yeah, I think
yeah,
so.
because
I could be
Tom Mix is
wrong.
from like about an hour away from here.
Yeah, yeah. Which we need to do a Tom Mix episode if we haven't
Oh,
already.
we will.
Um, but yeah, so he was the first owner. So it has that 1950s, 60s like Hollywood like connection vibe that I was just like, oh, that's so cool. So you have again, like you mentioned with the place that you stayed, you have a lot of like, you know, Hollywood legends coming in, but a lot of people coming in from Hollywood. So it just has like a cool kind of vibe to it.
Yeah, a lot of well-known people that traveled
Yes.
about, the people that could go anywhere and just happen to be in this place where you are now able to walk about.
Right, right. So at this same time is where one of the main ghosts comes from, apparently, for the Captain's Anchorage Tavern. So there was a bookkeeper that worked there for a long time, around this period of time in the 40s through the 60s, whose name was George. Now, George was a bookkeeper there, and it was said that he was embezzling money. Who he was embezzling money for is, you know, is up to speculation. If he was embezzling money, it was up to speculation too. He was
He
never
was
actually charged.
was he embezzling from the restaurant?
It seems like he may have been laundering
Okay.
stuff. Like he was taking money from the restaurant, and that was part of like a larger process. There could have been like mob ties. There could have been There could have been a
I
few
mean, I
things
can't
going on, it
imagine a
sounds.
resort in any era after the 1930s that wouldn't have mob ties.
Right, exactly. So it's like, yeah, it's almost like duplicative. But either way, something was going up with George, and he was murdered. There's originally they were like, oh, it's suicide. He was murdered, by all by all accounts. Um, and they're not sure who. It was never like charged or anything. The cops were like, oh, it's a suicide. It seems like the situation was he was clearly murdered by everyone's accounts. But so we have a restless spirit, it seems, popping up in the 50s and, or excuse me, in the early 60s, or not the 60s, because it was in the 77 that he died, 77. So it was little bit later. But we have George. So George is said to do a few different things. One of the things that he is most well known for is for exploding Crown Royal bottles, specifically. Not just any kind of mixed Canadian whiskey, Crown Royal.
With the purple velvet bag or
Yeah.
without the purple velvet bag.
I assume without the purple velvet bag, but actually that
Mm-mm.
would be kind of cool if it was they were just like imploding almost inside the bag. Um, but so he does that. People say that he throws around glasses. People hear footsteps, um, all kinds of stuff. And you have the kitchen staff and waiters and waitresses kind of talking about him all the time. Looking at some interviews that people had, a lot of it seems to be kind of like there's just this breadth of random occurrences that happen that people kind of just attribute to George. George isn't one of the apparitions that's seen, apparently. So it's just like something weird happens, people are like, oh, must be George. Even to the point where while interviews have been happening with journalists at this place on more than one occasion, stuff has happened and journalists have been like, oh, I guess there is something going on here, in different magazines or newspaper articles. In hindsight, how much of that was, kind of fluff pieces for the restaurant, it kind of reads like that. But so much stuff is happening that I feel like if there were people who wanted to debunk it at the time, they probably could have.
Well, this is one of the, you say about journalists and whatnot. I remember, I believe it was one of the ghost hunters.
Mm-hmm.
They went to a restaurant in California. It was a coastal restaurant. I don't believe it was this one because
Mm-hmm.
of that fact. And they left early in my memory because there were several fake things that were clearly set up in the bathroom and whatnot. And it was because they were capitalizing on the ghost stories and whatnot. Now that
Oh,
television
yeah.
group expressed frustration because they said, it's one thing to do that. It's one thing, it's a whole other thing to
Mm-hmm.
have people come in and are trying to be earnest and trying to figure out what's going
Right.
on and then not
Right.
tell us. So I could see that
It
going
could both
either
ways,
way.
for sure. Yeah.
I know I've talked about
Mm-hmm.
that there's a supposedly haunted restaurant. There was a report to do a supposedly haunted
Mm-hmm.
thing. Whatever. The bottom
Now,
line is, was this ever on television?
it was never until I couldn't find uh any interviews with journalists who were like there at the time doing an interview that then you see like a glass explode in the background or something like that. I couldn't find any of that happening. What I did find was there were times where the head chef, or is it the head chef? No, I think another was a current owner being interviewed, and they were kind of talking about George very specifically. So there are interviews out there, but at least in those ones, there obviously wasn't stuff like being staged to happen or anything. They were just more interest pieces, it seemed like. Um, but now, like I said, people don't tend to see George, but there are multiple apparitions in this place.
Question
Um,
about George, real quick.
mhm.
People don't see George, but they know it's George that's exploding the Crown Royal bottles. Why did
Yeah,
they attribute that to George? He was the bookkeeper. It's not like he was a really clumsy tender at
right. He
the
wasn't like
bar.
a right, exactly. It's yeah, it seems like that people just say like, oh, like that, footsteps,
He hates
thing.
Canadians.
Maybe hates, yeah, who knows, which would be a real shame. But yeah, it seems like all of the big bucket ghost activity just is kind of attributed to George almost. But like I said, people haven't I couldn't find anywhere where people said they saw George specifically. But it does kind of fit the unrestful spirit kind of trope there, assuming he was, murdered. As far as apparitions people do see, there's kind of two main ones that are on kind of both ends of the kind of ghost spectrum, I guess you would say. The first of that is an apparition of a woman who appears at the bar. Now, this is a woman who's said to be in like 80s clothes. So this is again kind of like one of those very like time specific apparitions.
Well, I do like this because again, we've talked about were ghosts even around until like the early Victorian age,
Right, yeah.
and it seems like there's been a pretty firm cutoff with most people. Like it has to at least be a person from an era that was mostly in black and white.
Right, yeah,
You
that's
don't.
yeah.
I'm not making fun. I mean, seriously, how many times have you heard of a ghost of a person like from the 80s?
Right,
Like a
exactly.
reoccurring spirit. It's not common. I think this is one of like the evolutions of ghost stories in themselves, is
Right.
that you might have a personal encounter with somebody more recent than that, but it's usually one or two events. It's not a continually
Right.
cycling
Right.
spirit like we hear have heard for generations.
Right, exactly. And that's why I do think this apparition of the woman at the bar, again, she's supposed to look like kind of like she's in the 80s. It doesn't say if she looks like she's like there for like a party or just hanging out. Doesn't really I couldn't find anything that said like what kind of clothes that she was wearing or anything, or if
I'm gonna
it was
say
for like an event.
DoorDash.
Right. But yeah, maybe. But this is an interactive spirit. This is one that patrons will talk to and will be seen interacting with folks, and then a bartender will realize what's happening and get the patron's attention, and then the ghost disappears, kind of thing. That seems to have happened on a few occasions enough that a lot of people uh, do think that it's some sort of like an interactive spirit, like it's someone that's trying to have conversations and doesn't isn't showing up like a creepy, see-through spirit. It's more like, oh, that's a person. Actually, it's
So,
not.
is this one of those stories where people find themselves engaging with this person only to realize that they are not there? They are not, we hear about that usually one of two ways. It's like somebody thinks it's a period reenactor,
Yes.
or
Yeah.
somebody doesn't realize, like the Resurrection Mary sort of stories where you're picking up somebody and they look a little out of place, but it's only revealed later that they're a deceased person.
Right. That's what it seems like, except they seem to be in the three or four accounts that I found, they were very short interactions. So it's hard to tell how much was actually happening there. But that is again kind of the other end of the spectrum as far as like ghost stuff goes. Then back going the exact opposite direction, we have a kind of classic stone tape ghost, which is a man who looks like he's in like 50s or 60s, like business garb, walking in and out of a porthole door in the restaurant. That's seen by patrons, it's seen by staff, cooks, everybody. That seems to be the most common apparition, even more than this woman at the bar. People just see him appear, walk through the door, disappear, kind of thing. Doesn't interact, doesn't move out of the way, none of those kinds of things. Which is interesting because, like, again, if there is something to the whole stone tape theory, like we talk about, where we have these kind of like just moments in time replaying, that fits that.
Yeah, and that's one of those hypotheses that I still kind of put some plausibility in. I find it a
Mm-hmm.
very interesting theory. I've expressed that before. I should say I find it a very interesting hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And I again have expressed that before.
Yeah, no, yeah, but I do think it's interesting, and I do kind of I'm not sure if it bodes well or not well for the legitimacy of all of these claims that a restaurant like this has the full spectrum or the whole gamut of ghostly activity happening. Everything from interactive spirits to all the poltergeist activity to a like the stone tape replays.
That is a good point. It's kind of like with in the X-Files episode about the alien autopsy, and it said
Right.
Oh, it can't be real. It shows too much. Like
Yeah.
there is just too much here. I think in our personal conversations we
Hmm.
talked about when that American Horror Story serial TV show came out.
Hmm.
Really enjoyed the first season, but even by like three-quarters of the way, we're like, really, how much could one location have
Yeah.
going on?
Hmm. Exactly. Exactly. But so, yes, I mean that kind of is the long and short of the Captain's Anchorage Tavern in Big Bear. It's a really popular place. Uh, has a ton of great Yelp reviews, which people aren't kind on there. So if the food
Right?
wasn't good, you'd hear about it.
It
You
counts for
know,
something.
it does. So, and again, I mean, it's one of those things where we talk about this whenever we're always because we both travel a lot as well as a lot of you do. Some of you are probably traveling right now. If you have a chance to stop and get a good club sandwich somewhere, and the place is reportedly haunted, that might swing your vote.
It's either that or if you find a place that I miss this sandwich. A club sandwich, standard
Hmm.
club, but with fried egg and Thousand Island dressing on it.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I'd give it a
If
shot.
if I had two, all other things being equal, one was haunted, one had that sandwich, I'm probably going with Thousand Island. But yeah, I have to say, I do, coming back very briefly, with regard to the stone tape.
Hmm.
Oh, we've talked about it a lot here and there. We never really had a singular thing where we
We
discussed
should do that.
only
Yeah.
that deeply. I'm just plugging that for you. But
Yeah.
we've talked, anytime we've spoken about it, we talked about, your computer. There are minerals in there, like quartz, and
Hmm.
quartz has some really interesting properties. For me to want to look into the stone tape thing more, I think you would have to isolate, well, what are the likely geological components necessary
Hmm.
in an area to facilitate that hypothesis? And,
Right.
I don't know enough about the geology of that region of California to know, like, okay, do you have quartz? Do you have these other minerals that would facilitate that sort of hypothesis?
So I'm actually bringing up the U.S. Geological Survey. Uh,
Let's say one day we should just have my dad on.
I know. Well, no,
He's a
seriously.
geologist, so
Yeah, no, seriously. No, but the USGS has a lot of really good information on it. And whenever someone says something like you just said, Nick, I'm like, well, let's check the map for magnetic anomalies in an area. Big Bear is generally red, which isn't quite as anomalous as purple. But yeah, we'll have to do a deep dive into that someday. That would be fun. Uh,
someday. But that's
because
Big Bear, California, huh?
So yeah, when it comes to it's red, whatever that means, we're gonna find out. But so yeah, so that's the Anchorage Tavern. Now it's funny that you mentioned the geologic side of things because that actually brings us to one of the next kind of like points in town, and this kind of gets into a lot of the other stuff I found. Like I said, we'll get to the BFRO and Bigfoot stuff and the UFO stuff, but as far as like other like urban legend folklore. I couldn't find much outside of just kind of like vague spooky areas.
Now, do you think that's because there's not a lot? Were there ever many permanent residents of the town itself?
Well, not since the 30s.
So I would attribute
Yeah.
some degree
Yeah.
that being the reason.
Right. There's just not enough
Because
people there all the time. Yeah.
right, right. Because I,
Yeah.
I only wonder because there's so many ghost towns around here now. A few of them have some
Mm-hmm.
stories that still linger in the greater region, but
Mm-hmm.
I imagine, like we talk about, you can't be a real town until you have a haunted house. I
Right.
wonder how many stories were lost just because
Just in the
populations dried
just because of
out and
population. Yeah.
those stories weren't maintained.
Hmm. I think that's part of logic because like there's tons of these little quote unquote ghost towns, different kind of ghost, and all of them say like, oh yeah, the cemetery is haunted or like whatever, but then you can't find any actual information on it in a lot of cases, and that's so which was a little disappointing because again out here when we do have a ghost town that is supposed to be haunted, there's at least a little bit of documentation that we can typically find, or like even if it's the same three stories, you find them posted 70 different places. I couldn't find that here. It was a lot of people saying, like, oh, this one canyon is spooky. Me and my friend went up it and we heard, felt weird. And then, like, no one else, there
Terrifying.
wasn't, yeah, like, dude, some of the stories out there, and this goes for anyone who's ever done any paranormal research, 99% of the stories are so lame. And, like,
Yeah,
it's
I
just
think
like,
that's one of the things we try to shine a light on a little bit. A
yeah,
lot of times things are very mediocre, and
right,
I climbed up this mountain and I felt a little weird. Well, maybe it's spooky. Maybe you just had a big jump in elevation, and
right.
maybe you're tired. Maybe you're as out of shape as I like to pretend that I'm not.
Yeah, and that comes from someone who gets weirded out in the woods all the time over here with me. And it's like, so yeah, from a storytelling, let me rephrase this. From a storytelling and folkloric standpoint, 99% of the things you find online are not terribly useful.
That's a
We'll
big yes
say.
from me.
But two of the things that I did see over and over again, one of them was back to these geologic anomalies, was an area called Castle Rock, which is up on, again, San Bernardino Mountains. It's a large kind of like cliff face with these like jagged quartzite rocks and everything, which again fits with the some of the stone tape stuff. There is probably an apocryphal story that I'm not even going to spend a lot of time on. It's just about a jilted Native American princess who her, husband or whatever, or betrothed, didn't come back from like a war or something, and she committed suicide off of this rock. I couldn't find any native source talking about that.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm gonna go out on a limb as I do, and I'm gonna say it's probably Jalberdash, only
yeah.
because I'm not gonna predict. I again have some, my mom's parents came off
Hmm.
out east, the East Band, but I only really know much about two of the three recognized tribes of relatives.
Hmm.
So I know there's, of course, the long held thing about like the Cherokee Chalagi princess. No such thing. It just
Right.
was not the way that society was set up. I'm not going to pretend that I know anything about Western tribes
Hmm.
to say that they had that sort of system, social
Hmm.
system. But I
Right.
don't. My instinct tells me no, because that same story, slightly different variables, is one of the ones we see in the Shoemaker tales
Right.
as well here in
Yeah.
Pennsylvania. So I think this is just kind of a trope.
That's what it seemed.
It's a
Yeah.
good story. It's a romantic story. It's romantic tragedy. Those are evergreen.
For
Uh,
any culture, for any culture, it's not just, yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
It's,
And so I think this is just
yeah.
gone
That's what it seemed like.
out of hand.
And you
Or
have,
maybe it was real, but it wasn't. Maybe the variables were different. It was just some woman. Or
right, exactly. But like I said, like either way, I couldn't find any what appeared to be native informed sources kind of adding any legitimacy to the story. Now, that being said, you have a lot of people saying that they run into, at least claiming to run into some kind of Native American woman on these trails that they think is a ghost. Could they still be having those experiences? We have other examples in folklore of things that definitely didn't happen that people apparently have experiences with.
agreed.
The whole idea of co-creation to some of these things. But I thought it was interesting that they have something like we said that we have kind of back east, and it's this kind of familiar trope, but no one's really, it didn't seem like people were really calling it out as that. Another one is lots of references to a hanging tree that they used to hang bandits from outside of town.
This,
And
I mean, just as at face value as the story, this one holds more plausibility to me.
right, right. And maybe there was just more than one tree, but like again, like I could, like all the stories I was looking at referenced different parts of different like adjacent towns where the tree was at, kind of thing. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's haunted, but like people just refer to it in the same kind of breath, like, oh, and there's the hanging tree. Um, and like I said, I couldn't find a whole lot else outside of that. Most everything else was like, oh, this one path is kind of spooky, but then no other real kind of context or anything.
So here's what I'm concluding so far about,
Mm-hmm.
Big Bear Lake and the surrounding area. There's a restaurant. It's got some good stories.
Mm-hmm.
Might the spread of the shot might be a little too wide. Like you said, they kind of have a little bit of everything. So that makes me suspicious.
Yeah.
They have a kind of a couple common stories. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That again, you're not really finding much hard evidence to support any historical basis for the story. What So it sounds, you came in and you said, what do people do around campfires? They tell stories.
Right.
Well, yeah, they're coming from other places. They're taking stories with them and sharing them around the fire. I don't know how many of these stories are being created at Big Bear.
Right. So that's kind of like the folklore and urban legend almost side of Big Bear. Now I do want to get into kind of the other side of the same coin, which is our kind of resident Sasquatch reports, and also some of the UFO reports. Those go together better and better, I think. So, like anywhere in California, you have Sasquatch sightings, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever name you want to use. So, I looked at a few different sources, and there's tons of stuff for the San Bernardino National Forest in general. Um, I picked out two that that were close to Big Bear Lake specifically that I thought were interesting. And well, I have a few here actually. So yeah, actually, let's go with these two because again, there was a ton to pick from. One is a little more elaborate, one is a little more normal. So if you're okay with it, Nick, I'm just going to go ahead and just read this first one whole cloth, if that's okay.
Absolutely, go for it.
So, tenure in the summer of 1976, San Bernardino County, right outside of Big Bear Lake. This is from a gentleman who goes by DM. And this is again reported to the BFRO. So the location, I believe it was on the west side of the lake. I remember when we drove through Big Bear City, the lake was on the passenger side. We traveled on a paved road and then a dirt road for a little ways. The cabin was a couple hundred yards off the dirt road. So it could be anywhere on the west side of the lake. So this is DM's story. I was living in Southern California at the time. I was 12 years old and was invited to my friend's family to stay with my friend's family to stay at a cabin with them at Big Bear Lake for the weekend. We arrived before noon that Friday, unloaded the Suburban, and helped my friend's dad take down the plywood from the windows before heading off to explore the woods and rock formations around the cabin. After dinner, we were discussing the next day's activities and went to bed. This sounds fantastic. The cabin looked like it had been there a while. Sometime during the night when I had to go to the bathroom and I knew the toilet wasn't working, so I got up and walked through the kitchen and turned on the light before going outside. I left the door open so the light would shine through and I closed the screen door behind me. I didn't want to go right there by the door, so I walked over to the tree line on the other side of the parking area. Was reaching down to start when I felt really scared. I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm laughing yet.
This kid is 12 years old, Brandon.
Because I know I shouldn't be laughing. I look over to my right, and about 20 feet away, something was looking at me over a bush. It was between two large trees and standing behind a bush, parting the top of the bush with its hands, like kind of like peeking through, looking at me. All I could see was the upper chest, head, arms, hands. I stood there looking at it for about 15 to 20 seconds, and then I bolted for the cabin. I didn't look back because I didn't want to. I ran up the steps and dove through the screen door, landing on the living room floor. I then reached back and slammed the door. I crawled to the other side of the room next to the couch before my friend's father came into the room. He walked over to me and asked what was wrong. I looked up at him and I just lost it. I was crying and shaking so much I couldn't speak. By the time my friend and his mother were there, and she helped calm me down a bit. I told them I went outside to go to the bathroom and something was standing there looking at me. They asked they asked me, was it a person? And I said no. It was huge, dark, and very tall. His father asked if it was a bear, and I said no. Bears don't have hands. My friend's father went and got his flashlight and then walked over to the door and opened it. He looked at the screen door and looked back at me. What happened to the screen? He said. I said I left the door open for some light. It jumped through, and when I ran back into the cabin, it broke. He looked back at the screen door for a second and then shut the door. My friend's mother said no one goes outside until morning when it's light out. We stayed up for a while, maybe an hour or so, before going back to bed. In the morning, I showed my friend's father where it was standing. In the spot where it was standing, he looked at the ground a little in the area nearby, but found nothing. He said that it was probably a bear. I told him it was not a bear. His face was flat and his hands had long fingers. He said we should stay close to the cabin the rest of the weekend and not go wandering around. Nothing else happened the rest of the weekend. Description of the face was very ape-like, and the nose area was different, not pronounced, just similar, with hair all over it except the mouth area and the eyes. I didn't see any eye shine at all, and the head was pointed. The upper chest was massive, very wide and powerful looking. I noticed the hands when I looked over at it at night. The hands were long with some hair, not as much as the rest of it though. I did see a thumb on the left hand when it was parting the top of the bush. The bush was taller than me, and at the time I was 5'7". I didn't smell or hear anything.
Pretty tall kid, I want to say, for to be 12 and
Yeah,
5'7".
5'7". He's a big
That's
boy.
a pretty interesting story.
Yeah. And there's a long follow-up conversation that the BFRO investigator has with him that doesn't really have any like additional information, just kind of more clarifying, and a lot of it's over how the thing kind of looked, but it's just more kind of expanding on what he kind of already said. But that's like a classic 1976 Bigfoot account.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah,
again,
I'm surprised when the friend's dad went out that they weren't going to say like he saw footprints or he saw
I know,
some
yeah.
sort of sign of something. I maybe it would be one of those things that would have made it too perfect. Maybe it was a bear, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't again, we don't know how experienced, how often this kid's seeing bears. It's also night. It's
Right.
also he left the light on for because he was probably a little nervous about some
Mm-hmm.
things. So
Understandable.
yeah, these are all understandable things. But it's an interesting story nonetheless, and obviously and rightfully, kid was pretty scared about it. And obviously, he's writing about it as an adult many years later. But
Yeah. But I mean,
yeah,
I thought it seemed like like at least a well-formed story in the sense that like, I don't know. It
probably
just
one he'd been telling for some time.
right, exactly. Yeah, I just thought that was a good classic kind of 1970s class A
I'm into
Southern
it.
California, Bigfoot story. So one that's similar that takes place 20 some odd years later in 1993. Again, 1993 Los Angeles, like I
Rodney
mean,
King era,
yeah,
Los
like
Angeles.
it's just these are definitely of the era. But so this one is from again, this is someone who used their full name, Brian Francis Butler. I do like when people use their full names on reports. Not casting shade at people who don't, but like when people put their name on it, I do kind of appreciate that. So this is in the Barton Flats campground just southwest of Big Bear Lake. Brian says, I was sleeping in my van with my two friends, and they were sleeping in a tent about 15 feet away. I couldn't go to sleep, and I heard something walking around outside. I could hear snoring coming from the direction of the tent, and when I peeked out the window, I couldn't see anything. I started to get up, and all of a sudden, the van started rocking violently back and forth, and I was thrown from side to side. I yelled real loud, and the shaking stopped. My friends called from the tent and asked what the problem was, and at that point, I grabbed my flashlight and pulled back the curtains covering the back window and shined the flashlight outside. The figure moved towards the left, and I could see it was walking upright like a man, but it had hair from head to toe. And the second I saw it walk past the front windshield and head into the forest, I pulled open the side door and jumped out, yelling for my friends to get up. It smelled really bad, like a cesspool around our campsite, and I was badly shaken. We started a fire and talked about what had just happened, and I learned that something had been tossing pebbles into the top of their tent, and they thought it was me. and then something had brushed up against the back of their tent just before the van started shaking. They also thought that was me. But after I told them about the van, they swore it couldn't have been them and wasn't me either. We headed home early the next day. Later, I remembered seeing a pair of glowing yellowish eyes through the trees after we had first arrived, but they disappeared almost immediately, and I figured it was just a deer or something to that effect.
Now, I
So
don't
that's
know if I put
Ryan's
much
story.
into the yellow eye thing because it was remembered after the fact, but that's
Right.
another interesting story. I like that because, again, outside of the eyes remembered after
Mm-hmm.
the fact, didn't really see anything. But at the same time, that could have been any number of animals. We
Mm-hmm.
know, obviously, throwing pebbles, well, that could have been acorns and
Mm-hmm.
whatnot because we squirrels will do that. If you camp
Mm-hmm.
under where a squirrel is treed,
Oh, for
they
sure.
will throw things at you to get you to move.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't
And
sound unreasonable.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree. And yeah, and it does have like those like we hear stories about Bigfoot shaking vehicles. That's like a common thing in some of these stories. I do like the fact that he saw a when he said something that was big and hairy and walking upright. Yeah, so it's not like a didn't get a great look at it obviously because it was nighttime and like I said they didn't have a fire going at the time, you know. But like again, a 1993 flashlight through the back of a Dodge conversion van rear window. Those are small windows. Those windows are like maybe 16 by 16. They're not big. So yeah, I think that has a few interesting points to it, but
I agree to that. Again, spooky story. If you were there, I totally
mhm,
get it. You got things being thrown, even if it's just pebbles. I think again, it was probably the work of a squirrel. I forgot about the seeing something walk on two legs, but
yeah.
even if
And
you had identified that as a bear,
mhm,
I would be just as scared because why are
right,
bear? You know what I mean?
right. It doesn't,
So
yeah. It's
I will
still
say this, as far as the identification goes, and as far as what is this conflation, I think so clearly. But when you are scared, and there were legitimate reasons for the adrenaline and instinct to take over there, you react. And I think the
right.
reaction to leave the way, I think that was entirely appropriate and whatnot. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think we're looking at like left of the spectrum, center of the spectrum. Now let's look at the right side of that gauge. I want to see what you think about this one. I do want
Because it's
to
called Big Bear Lake, right?
It's
So I'm
called Big Bear
assuming there's some
Lake.
bears. Are,
Well,
this
well,
is
the
the bear state.
funny thing, the reason it was called Big Bear is in 1933, they captured 27 black bears from Yellowstone and tried to relocate them. But when they went to relocate them, they basically just like took up residence in town and started like scaring everybody. You
I
know,
like it.
yeah, it was like good for the bears. Like again,
Right.
it sounds like a great spot.
We've lost so much habitat.
Yeah. And
We're turning this
you guys are gonna
franchise
pick us up.
around.
You guys are gonna pick us up from Yellowstone, drop us in Big Bear again, which is nice. But like, yeah, you know, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, kind of thing. Okay, so here's the last BFRO story I want to read. So this is again back to 1975.
Golden era of
Golden
Bigfoot.
era of Big Bear. Like again, I mean the Anchorage Tavern was probably hopping. You know,
Oh
like
yeah, your
it's just
guy was still alive,
yeah,
survived.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't know he had 1 year to go, but come
Right.
on.
But so okay, so this is anonymous, but now a law enforcement officer. We're just called anonymous. So anonymous says, I remember the day like it was yesterday. It was my first Boy Scout summer camp, and I was 12 years old. We had traveled from Long Beach, California on a Saturday, the day before the other troops were scheduled to arrive. Our scout troop was through our church, and we didn't like to travel on a Sunday. When we arrived at the camp, we discovered that the camp staff had all went to went to the lake in Big Bear to parties, so we were the only scouts in the campground that day. We went down to our assigned campsite and set up camp. It was approximately 11 p.m. when we heard the first screams. We were all gathered around the outdoor stove telling jokes and stories when we heard the first scream. It started out like a wolf howl, but ended like a man's scream. It stopped the crickets from chirping. Our scoutmaster came out of his tent to listen as well. Then we heard it again. It sounded like it came from about 1 mile south of our campground. Needless to say, we were scared. So we all went to sleep around 12 a.m. Then about 1 a.m., my buddy Kenny woke me up and told me that there was something moving around the bushes and trees next to our campground. We all woke up and Kenny got up and walked over to where the rustling was coming from. He then shined his flashlight into the area north of our campground, and there it was. A Sasquatch was standing in the tree line looking at us. We all broke out yelling and screaming. It was about 6 to 7 feet tall, had brown hair all over except for the face. It had a very short neck, long arms going down to its knees. Its eyes reflected the flashlight's beam like a rabbit's would. The eyes shone red. It turned and with long steps walked northeast from the area, then up a steep wooded hill and out of sight. One of the guys actually pissed his pants from fright.
And we never let him forget about it.
Okay, so lot to unpack in this one. So
Wait, pause
like
real quick
yeah,
before you get there.
yeah.
Can you read the description of what they saw again?
So what he says, it had a very short neck and long arms, stood about 6 to 7 feet tall, and had brown hair all over except for the face. Its eyes reflected the flashlight's beam like a rabbit's would, and the eyes shone red.
Okay, and it started walking towards them. They ran and
Mm-hmm.
got away, obviously.
They did,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. That one's a little more interesting, but um I don't know.
Yeah.
Is this thing again, I'm thinking it's probably a bear. Is it related to the screams? Are these two?
Right. Right.
Because again, we've talked about it before. I worked in an office at the time. Somebody played a sound. They're like, "What is that?" And they had people guessing. And
Mm-hmm.
everyone's, yeah, it's a woman screaming. I was like, "No, that's a fox."
Mm-hmm.
You've been in the woods with me when we've heard a fox.
Ooh, I don't
And
like it.
even though you know exactly what it is,
Yeah.
unless you see the fox
God,
and
yeah.
like the fox like gives you thumbs up, gives you a little bit of warning,
Yeah.
it's still scary when you hear a
Yeah.
fox. It is a blood curdling sound.
Yeah.
A peacock, peafowl, same
Mm-hmm.
thing. Yeah, so
Yeah. There's a lot of things that make a lot of really wild noises. I'd actually love to play a game of name what that awful sound is from. That actually sounds fun. We might have to
name
we
that
might have
awful
to
sound.
we might have to curate that game at some point.
I
Um,
think that's a great
but
idea.
yeah, so like there's a few things that happen here that might not be necessarily related, you know. I think that's a good point to call out. I think that if we're going with the quote unquote flesh and blood hypothesis with Bigfoot, the one thing that doesn't match up here, that if you're playing your ghost furnace bingo, I'm going to mention the tapetum lucidum, which is the part of the back of the eye that reflects for certain animals. Primates don't have that, and almost none of them reflect red because of
And
the
again,
dyes.
unless you're one of the interdimensional aquatic Bigfoot believers, most everybody says Bigfoot is some sort of primate, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
okay,
So yeah,
yeah.
if we're going with the flesh and blood thing, it doesn't quite hold water there. Now, granted, you have a bunch of kids. That's where we get into like the weird side of things, where if you have a bunch of kids who are from Long Beach, California, that are going on their first, Boy Scout, you know, summer camping trip, that is primed for a really weird situation. For so something weird's going to happen on the woo side of the spectrum. That's a great setting for it.
Well,
Everyone's
it could
ready.
also be, again, I'm not slagging on Boy Scouts. A lot of
Hmm.
them don't like, if you're in the Boy Scouts, as I'm making sweeping generalizations here.
Yeah.
If you are in the Boy Scouts, it's probably because you live in the town or city.
Hmm.
Because it's a way for you to develop some real
Right.
outdoor stuff and
Yeah.
enjoy that. It's something novel. I get that. I'm not slagging anybody for it. I think a lot of the leaders in that, some of them are more outdoorsy people. Some of them are
Hmm.
just grown boys that are kind of looking for that same thing. And it's all well intentioned, it's all good. But
Right.
I was very briefly in the Boy Scouts, and I think my small sample pool can attest to that there being some bearing for that.
Yeah.
However, there are some adults in that world that are very knowledgeable, and that is their
For sure.
lifestyle. And I could also imagine, especially because of the time period we're talking about, where some adults got together and thought that was hilarious. Do
Right.
that, right?
Oh,
Would
it's
you
a
would
yeah,
you
if
put it
you're
past?
right, yeah. It's you could understand reasonable people being
Yes.
like being like, we're gonna scare the heck out of these kids.
Timmy
Timmy Piss Pants over
Thurlson is
here
going to
is
urinate himself. That kid barely keeps it in overnight. This is gonna be awesome. Who is in?
you can
I'm in.
understand.
I'm in,
Yeah.
and this is like
Yeah.
45, 50
Yeah.
years too late.
But it sounds like it was a classic Bigfoot experience either way. Like this is one of those stories that kind of falls into that category of I'm like, I don't almost care what's real. It's just such a fun story that like,
I agree with that. I agree with that.
that it's just a fun story and I'm
And again,
glad that
if
it's out there,
if it is
you
a
know.
bear, well, one again, you see something like that. Are you really taking a lot? I don't. Maybe you are.
Yeah.
Are you really taking notice of like the the eye shine?
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know.
I don't know.
I
It's
probably think my
yeah,
mind again would go to a primal place.
right.
Where I was like, I got to play dead or run,
Or
and I'd be
something.
looking more about the mass. I'd be
Hmm.
looking at the
This
size of this thing
right.
too.
Well, that's the thing is, yeah, like I mean, like you've seen bears in the wild too, and like
Yeah,
there's a big difference between seeing like a yearling that is like, size of a,
goodness, yes.
that's like, like 70 pounds, something like that. It's like, yeah, that's still a big animal. You see one that's like full grown, and it's like that's like it's like you don't realize how big a 200-pound animal in the wild is, like,
Right. And I'm not the first to say it. A small animal will mess you up.
oh
It
yeah.
will mess you up because Chuck Klosterman in his book Downtown Owl had this
Oh, love
really
that.
great. It was
Yeah.
his first nonfiction. There's only
Hmm.
two embarrassing parts in it, but I
Yeah,
like the book. But he had a great thing. He's like, people that fight for a reason will lose to a person that fights for no reason
for sure.
because
Yeah.
they have an economic as they're fighting over some girl, for example,
Or
and they're
whatever.
getting
Yeah.
their head repeatedly pounded into the pavement. Eventually, they're going to say she's not worth it, right? And also that there are rules. There's no rules if this is a real fight.
Right.
So an animal has that. An animal is going to do, and so even a small animal will mess you up. However, if I am in the woods and I am confronted with like a dog.
Yeah.
And then again, this is what I'm saying. I'm going to a primal place and I'm
Hmm.
looking at like how big is this thing? I see a snake, I walk back slowly,
Yep.
stay
Every
cool,
time.
stay cool. You see different things, but if I saw a bear standing on two
Hmm.
legs, you do the whoa
Yeah.
bear thing,
Yep.
depending on what
Hmm.
type of bear it is, you put your arms up and you talk chill, give the slow jam voice, or
Yeah.
you lay down like an idiot and you just but I'm not looking at eye shine. I'm either running it, but
Yeah.
if I saw something like that, yeah, I don't blame Timmy.
I don't
Uh,
blame Timmy either.
but
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, yeah, if I saw a dog though, and it's like I can't outrun this dog, the
Hmm.
dog is not going to let me. This is going to suck, but
It's gonna,
I'm going to
it's
try
gonna
to
be
hurt that dog.
right. Yeah. It's just
I'm not checking out the way its ear sits or the
yeah.
shine
Right.
in its eye.
Right. And it's yeah. It goes both ways. I think there's you remember weird things about traumatic situations, but at the same time, it's like convenient that that it's
I don't know how
a
much
trope,
we're
you know.
remembering and how much we're putting in. That's
Right,
the
exactly. Yeah, like it's probably yeah, again, we'll do a whole episode on the invisible gorilla at some point. But so yeah, so that's kind of like the again, I thought that was a good class A sampling of like the full spectrum of types of reports that people are having around Big Bear. So when you're thinking like 1970s classic movie Bigfoot sightings, like that's what people are getting. It's great. So the last kind of thing I wanted to hit real quick, I know we're probably going a little long here, but if you're still with us, thank you. I found a new, it's not well, new to me, UFO reporting site. This is NUFRORC, which rolls right off the tongue. I'll put a link to their map in tonight's show notes. I'm still learning about the organization, so like I reserve the right to rescind this opinion later. So far, it seems really good. Like the map is really interactive. And when you look at the reports and how they follow up on them, they keep in all the reports that they get. And if they have something that is like lines up with like a rocket launch or something, like they put that in, So it seems like the kind of research they're doing and the kind of, I guess, kind of like lens they're taking to UFO reports, it seems good so far. When you look up Big Bear, just for the town itself, there are like eight, at least in this resource, there's like 18 in the last 20 years, which doesn't seem like a ton to some people, but as far as like reports that have been submitted to like some of these locations, that's actually quite a bit. Given that this is Southwest United States, I always think, oh, this is prime big black triangle territory. You have the stealth bombers, you have
Yeah.
the you have the B2s,
Phoenix
um,
Lights even or
Phoenix Lights,
trying
all
or
that stuff.
theirs.
You have a lot of Air Force bases on the West Coast, so just it's prime for that kind of thing. Now, when you look at the list of what they have just for Big Bear in the last 20 years, again, just for in town, it's all over the place. It's everything from just lights to discs to the triangles to orbs to things that are changing shape. The kind of like silver sphere balls, all kinds of things. So I wanted to bring up two real quick that I thought were interesting, partly because of the follow-ups. And these ones also had like photos and videos associated with them, which is again kind of cool because you're seeing what people are talking about. So then this first one is from just outside Big Bear Lake. You can see the lake in the video. This one starts by saying a light appeared rapidly from the west side of the sky, heading slowly towards the east and began to dim and finally disappeared. So the full story is the first night at the Airbnb, my girlfriend and I rented for Memorial Day weekend. And as we were on the back deck, we noticed this bright light emitted out of thin air. So luckily we had our phones on our person and began to record and film this bright object over the sky. At first, we thought it was a rocket, but it didn't have a tail like they normally do. So as it began to slowly dim and dim, we noticed the object looked like it had a pyramid shape to it. The object then disappeared into thin air. Not sure what it was, but it was definitely not an airplane because the planes looked nothing like this bright object. Also, didn't make any sound, and all the planes passing by did. Also, excuse the language in the video, not sure how to edit that out. Again, my apologies. Never seen anything like it before. I hope this video footage helps in my data and to hopefully help others who experience the same thing that night in Big Bear, California. So the reason I bring that up, one, it sounds like a pretty crazy UFO, and the video, it's a cell phone video, but it looks pretty crazy. You're like looking at it, you're like, I'm not sure what this is. The reason I thought this was interesting is because there are three other reports from Big Bear that night with the same thing, which you don't get very often on these kind of reports on these sites. The fact that three random people out of 100,000 people on Memorial Day weekend recorded this thing and went to the same site to report it, who weren't like together. It'd be different if they were all on the same back porch, but they all sound very, very similar. This is one where the organization went through and said explanation certain rocket for all of them. And they go on to say that there was a SpaceX launch that evening. So this was
Okay.
some kind of SpaceX. So they're right. It wasn't a plane, and it wasn't the
Right.
typical rocket that maybe they were used to seeing coming out of
Well,
whatever
there
the
you go.
launcher.
A perfect UFO. It was unidentified,
Right. Yeah, and that's
and now it is
and
identified.
yes, it was. Yeah, was that? Yeah. So like, I think that's actually a cool example of like, yeah, a lot of people saw something weird and we figured out what it was.
Yeah, I do. That does strike for some credibility for these people
Mm-hmm.
because whatever this group is, because again, yeah, people, the true believer is going to want to believe.
Yes. So when we look at, so that's one of the ones that I just thought was like interesting because it is. But again, that's the kind of stuff that generates this folklore. So like, here's another one. So on Saturday, May 26, 2021, around 11:20 p.m. at the RTMC Astronomy Expo. So this is someone who looking up in the sky a lot. My friend and I were walking down the road to get to our car when I noticed a bright object come over the hills from the west, moving very much like a satellite, only it was brighter than a satellite. I ran to my car to get my binoculars, naturally thinking that if this was too bright to be a regular satellite, maybe it was the International Space Station. When the object was about at its zenith, it slowed to a stop. My friend and others camping in the area exclaimed in surprise when this happened. I trained my binoculars on the object and discovered that it was actually two objects, one glowing bright yellow that we had been following with our naked eyes, and then a much dimmer, deep blue one floating around it. When the yellow object was now moving very slow and steady, the blue one seemed to orbit it tightly and rapidly, almost with a haphazard motion. After meandering around the sky for maybe 1 or 2 minutes, it began to climb. I could not judge its altitude. People around us thought that it was anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 feet up through the binoculars. I'm guessing it was about 1,000 to 10,000 feet and climbing, but who knows? Eventually, the blue object slipped behind the yellow object and we never saw it again. At that moment, the yellow object began to gyrate rapidly and wildly in a small area and seemed to leave a short trail. I thought maybe my binoculars were shaking, but this was not the case since the background stars were not themselves gyrating. The object continued to climb rapidly until it was difficult to see even with binoculars, and then we lost it. I'm guessing the whole thing lasted about 6 minutes, and the whole time we did not hear any sounds of the objects. And then the reporter goes on to talk about everything else that they did that evening. But so that's kind of a crazy UFO sighting from people who are used to looking up at the sky, it sounds like. What do you think about that one?
I think that of all the stories this evening, that's the one that's the most intriguing. I
Yeah.
think I think there's been a few interesting stories. I think most of the Bigfoot ones are explainable to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Again, just hearing the stories as they're told, I think I could find very natural ways to write these off. Not that the people weren't right to be scared, not that they
For
weren't in a
sure.
situation worthy of that. But yeah, this last one I think this holds the most mystery. And I think it seems like it's probably somebody that's a little credible, at least just on first
Right.
blush of like you
Yeah.
can find different things in the sky. So yeah, I think that one's interesting.
I think so too. I think that it's someone who, again, not that anyone is any more or less trustworthy when it comes to the storytelling element, but people who are used to looking at the sky are maybe a little bit better at generally identifying things that seem unusual or not. Whether, because again, this person's not saying, oh, these were aliens. They're just saying, oh, here's this
Right.
weird light kind of thing. So
I like that.
it doesn't seem terribly sensationalized. It has, I like the fact that whenever they're talking about the altitude, like they put in, but who knows? Like there's some,
Yeah, there's
there's some,
there room to be for them to have been wrong.
so yeah, I like that story, and I like that we have such a breadth of stories coming out of this area. When it comes to Big Bear, do you think there is more or less weird things happening there than what you initially anticipated with this one, Nick?
Well, I didn't know what to anticipate, but I'm going to say I don't think it's a particularly creepy place. I think it's where a lot of people go to get into nature a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful looking. I've never been there myself. Um, and yeah, I think it's probably a very normal place. There's one story that's really intrigued me, but I like the reserve that the storyteller presents it with, and
Yeah.
their apparent willingness to take a completely natural explanation for what they observed. So no, I don't think Big Bear's creepy. I don't think,
Yeah.
so I'm going to say less.
Yeah, I think that it was actually I expected to find more crazy folklore in the area, and I expected the stories that I found associated even with the Bigfoot and UFO stuff to be a little more off the wall. And that wasn't necessarily the case. I still really enjoyed looking up and researching everything with Big Bear. It seems like a wonderful place, but my hypothesis was not correct this time, which is okay.
If you visit or live in Big Bear, and you can prove us wrong, and you say there is more weird stuff going on than meets the eye, how would somebody let us know about our inaccuracies?
Great question. You can do that by either finding us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube at the Ghost Furnace Podcast, or you can just send us an email at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.